Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 111, Dorothy Arzner's Due.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to do another one of the underthought about, underappreciated directors from Hollywood's past, partially because she was female. And we're going to talk about her. She has a really interesting career. And let's jump into that right away and kind of some of her biography. She was born in 1897 in San Francisco, and her parents eventually moved to LA where they owned a restaurant. And there, very young Dorothy would rub elbows with some of Hollywood's elites at the time, including Mary Pickford, Max Sennett, Douglas Fairbanks, and other famous people. She would go on to study medicine at USC and joined a local ambulance unit during World War I. But after the war, opportunities came up that allowed her into the film industry, where she met with William DeMille.
Ironically, one of the things that kind of gave her a foothold into the film industry was the Spanish flu, which shut down Hollywood and left a lot of job openings. So, just while we're still, at the tail end, hopefully, of the whole pandemic thing, like the pandemic is one of the things that actually gave Dorothy Arzner a foothold into an industry and made her a trailblazer.
Yeah, there's a lot of industry shakeups there. I think we talked about this on a bonus podcast before, but the flu essentially gave a pause in the industry, and people who acted aggressively during that pause quickly became the super studios of the future, including Famous Players Lasky, which during this time formed into Paramount.
And acting aggressively seems to be one of Dorothy Arzner's defining traits.
Yes, it is definitely one of the reasons for her success. But anyway, when she worked at Famous Players Lasky, she had the chance to watch Cecil DeMille on set. And to quote her, if one was going to be in this movie business, one should be a director, because he was the one who told everyone else what to do. And then she started in the script department. She tried to start in the set decoration department, because that's a little more stereotypically female at the time, but William DeMille actually asked her to redesign his room on the spot and realized that she was bullshitting him, but it was a pretty good bullshit, so he put her in the script department instead. She also worked as an editor, and she cut 52 films at a Paramount subsidiary company called Real Art Studio, until being recalled to Paramount proper to cut Blood and Sand from 1922, which is a famous Rudolph Valentino film. Rudolph Valentino being one of the first, true heartthrobs of the silver screen. Like, women would, especially younger teenage girls, would go ballistic over Rudolph Valentino. He died tragically young. There's a whole story there. But it was a very significant film in both her and Hollywood history. And she actually got to direct and shoot some of the bullfighting scenes in that movie, essentially as a second unit director. This work caught the attention of another director named James Cruz, who employed her as a writer and editor, and during which time she gained enough leverage to threaten to leave Paramount if she didn't get to direct a movie. And then she got to direct a movie. Her first was called Fashions for Women in 1927, and it was successful. Essentially filling that role of the woman's picture that we've talked of before. That success got her 3 more silent films at Paramount, followed by her ability to direct Paramount's first sound picture, The Wild Party, from 1929, during which she worked with Clara Bow, who was the famous it girl of the time, and, very importantly, on that set, Clara Bow was having a hard time acting with the microphone being in a very set place, which anybody who's seen Singing in the Rain can tell you about the scene. So Dorothy Arzner had the sound guy put the microphone on a fishing rod, therefore essentially creating the first ever boom mic, which is a very important part of cinema, and one of the first instances of mobile lighter cinema that ever existed, and that you'll see become a big thing in the 60s.
And honestly, one of the hardest jobs on set, so I'm sure there's a lot of...
It's a difficult one. Yeah. Obviously, they didn't use fishing poles forever. Once they realized how good of a technique it was, somebody actually developed a set
boom
fixed
pole,
rod for a boom pole to work. And now we have fancy, like, carbon fiber ones.
Mechanical rigs and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, you have all sorts of stuff now. But that was the first time that it got put on a mobile section, and that was important. She also directed one Frederick March in his first film, On the Wild Party, which is also important. He would actually go on to, I believe, be Mary Pickford's second husband as well as a very successful actor in his own right during the silent and early sound era. Then she went on to direct many very early films or very prominent early star turns for various famous leading ladies of the 30s, helping to either kickstart or push the careers forward of Katharine Hepburn, who she directed in her first movie, Christopher Strong, in 1933, Rosalind Russell in Craig's Wife from 1936, and Lucille Ball from a movie we're going to talk about today in Dance Girl Dance. Ironically enough, Lucille Ball had been known as the Queen of the Bees before that and kind of cycled into her stardom slowly after that, and eventually her businesswoman savvy. Dorothy Arzner was the only female director to successfully transition to sound era Hollywood out of silent era, and she was the first and only woman for a very long time in the DGA. I believe she was succeeded by Ida Lupino, which is important. She eventually left Hollywood after 1943's First Comes Courage, which was a World War II film. And then she shot many WAC, Women's Army Corps, training videos during World War II. She was friends with somebody at Pepsi who got her the rights to shoot like over 70 Pepsi commercials over the next few decades. And that's basically, she got super rich doing this.
Yeah, no kidding.
And she shot a lot of them actually with Joan Crawford. And eventually she would teach at UCLA during the 60s. And one of her students was a very young Francis Ford Coppola, who quite liked her films and cites her as a very large influence on his style. But that's kind of the biographical story, but let's take a look at some of the movies we're going to talk about for today. Jonathan, which would those be?
Yeah, so we're starting off with Get Your Man from 1927, which is a silent film starring Clara Bow, which we just mentioned, and Charles Buddy Rogers. And then we'll be moving on to Merrily We Go to Hell from 1932, which is sound, but technically pre-code, and we're going to probably have to get into that. I think the code takes effect in 34, so just before the code.
Yeah.
Is based on the novel I, Jerry, Take Thee, Joan by Cleo Lucas, and it stars Sylvia Sidney and Frederick March. And finally, we'll be looking at Dance Girl Dance from 1940. As we already mentioned, stars Maureen O'Hara and Lucille Ball in a very uncharacteristic, in the way that we think of her now, role. And I'm very excited to talk about that. Lucille Ball's character is just like diametrically opposite of what we expect from a Lucille Ball character these days.
Yes, it's very, very different from her comedy days. And I also just remembered, it wasn't Frederick March who married Mary Pickford. It was Charles Rogers who married Mary Pickford. I knew he was in one of the movies today. I got it mixed up. I apologize. But anyway, let's jump into it, starting with Get Your Man from 1927. Jason, take it away.
Get Your Man from 1927. A handsome European nobleman, Robert, played by Charles Rogers, has been promised since birth to another noble family's daughter. Alas, he's fallen for an adventurous and liberal American girl, Nancy, played by Clara Bow. The arranged marriage threatens to keep the two young loves apart until Nancy cooks up a zany and clever plan to dissolve the engagement.
All right, Jonathan. So this is the only silent film we're going to talk about today. What I had actually seen it before. What did you think of it?
Okay, I do have a question about this. In what way did you watch this? Did you watch the YouTube version that does not have any underlying score?
No, I watched I believe I watched this on Amazon with the score.
Oh, okay. Is it on Amazon?
Yes.
Some of these I was having trouble finding places to actually rent them. So there's a version on YouTube. Technically, I think it's public domain looking at Wikipedia right now because Paramount
it definitely should be. It's very
didn't
old.
renew the copyright at some point. So you can find this online. And so basically what I did is I watched it on YouTube with no score. And then I found a Spotify playlist that's literally like hundreds of hours of just silent film music. And so I just shuffled that, and sometimes it worked really well with the movie and sometimes not so much, but it was fun. So, yeah, I thought it was very interesting. It definitely feels, like a very kind of classical type of story. Like it has this, we talk about transcontinental accents sometimes, but it almost has like a transcontinental thematic base in that there's this weird, like, royalty thing, and yet it's still like halfway in the modern era, and there's this prearranged marriage that we start off with, which is just, it's really funny way to begin. So it starts with a title that says this is the betrothal day of whatever the guy's name is, I'm already forgetting, of Robert Albin to the Simone de Valin or whatever, and it's like, it's all French, very aristocratic. And then we open on this like 5-year-old kid kissing the hand of like a 2-year-old baby, and so we get the idea that this is a prearranged marriage. And then as the story goes on, we get into like the whole kind of mixed love triangles and stuff like that, but just opening it on that kind of just almost right off the bat already subverting our expectations of, like, you know, prearranged marriage, and like showing how, like, going to a really archaic place in this idea of relationships and stuff in order to kind of play around with even kind of some general ideas about marriage.
Yeah, it's very much got the aesthetic of like that pre World War II broad European, very much like the Ernst Lubitsch kind of cosmopolitan feel, or like almost think like the Grand Budapest Hotel, where everybody speaks English somehow. You can understand all of the European people, even in their fanciness and their
I mean,
oddity,
in silent
because
film,
they
you
have
just
nobility.
change the inner titles, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. But it does have that metropolitan or cosmopolitan, feel to it, which is interesting and fun. And the story I wouldn't call it ambitious in any sense of the term. No. This is very much like a studio kind of like off the line movie. But it is well done, and it is fun.
It does have
and
its moments though.
Yeah. And I love when the old dude's playing music to try to seduce the young American female lead. And I think the most notable thing about this film when it comes to Dorothy Arzner is how the romance in this movie feels compared to other movies that I've seen from this era. This romance actually feels fairly two-sided, and it doesn't feel creepy. Those are kind of like the two big bullet points. Like, there's a lot of times when you go to these older movies and you watch the romance, and it just feels like weird or creepy or like forced in some way, and very male gazy. And in this one, it just doesn't feel that same type of way.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest elements that goes into that, and the biggest takeaway that I had from this movie, is Clara Bow's character, who's the American socialite or whatever you want to call her, but she basically holds all the power in every scene that she's in. Sometimes the men in the scene don't even realize it, but she is like decidedly calling the shots throughout pretty much all of the film, which is definitely something that you don't see in films this old, and sometimes not even today. But yeah, right. She's definitely like one of the very first things after, you know, the really coincidental plot thing where after he goes back home after meeting her in Paris or whatever, and then she like her motorcycle crashed, and so she's like staying with him now, and his fiance is there, and he's like, no, I love you, I have to be with you now that you're here, and she's like she's loving it, but you only see that on her face when he's not looking at her, and then when he is looking at her, she's like, oh, I don't care, blah blah blah, and so she's like, she's totally manipulating him, and then I mean that goes into the end, which I definitely, I mean, would work up to it, but like she causes all the problems and then solves all the problems all at the same time, basically.
Yeah, no, she has a ton of agency in this movie, and she comes off as an incredibly likable character the entire time, which is excellent. Because I think there is this bad tendency of male directors to occasionally try to make good female characters, and they don't do it very well, and just make them
or they like
kind
overcompensate
of like
or something.
Yeah, it's like the overly like strong female protagonist. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The one who says, oh, why would you comment about my body first, or something like that, like making a really obvious comment about it.
Yeah. They lean like a little too hard into it being obvious rather than having them be natural characters.
Yeah. Just normal people.
Yeah. But in this one, it feels very nice. This is also our first Clara Bow movie ever.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is interesting. She is pretty significant. We talked about Mary Pickford before on her own full episode, but Clara Bow was who dethroned her. And with the rise of the flapper, Mary Pickford's aesthetic was that of a cute young girl, essentially, which there's a lot to unpack there psychologically with America's obsession with youth.
We kind of got into that with the Mary Pickford.
We did. But she was dethroned with the rise of the 20s and the flapper aesthetic, which was signified most by Clara Bow, and in her movie The It Girl, which
or It, I think
it was just called It, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that has a different connotation now.
Yes, it does. No clowns, I think.
Nope.
No, at least no killer clowns, I think. I haven't seen it. But at the very least, she kind of dethroned with the change in style. She kind of became representative of the 20s as a decade, essentially, of style, dethroning Mary Pickford. And then by the time the 30s roll around, you had a whole new set of female leads, all vying to be the queen of Hollywood. And you could probably go year by year and figure out who it was. But all that is to say that this is another interesting point in film history, because this is when we established that the ruling royalty of Hollywood is meant to be forever changeable. And I don't even know if it really exists anymore, but certainly at the time it did.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of arguable, but I think that the film industry has just grown so much that there are probably too many and too broad of a range of audience and stuff to really have this is the one person. At
it's
this
all
point
about
anyway.
niche culture now.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there will be. I don't think there will be anything that's broad and dominant again, at least not for a very long time.
Yeah. So there's some interesting things in this movie. Like there's a whole scene in this wax museum that I was not expecting.
Oh yes, that one.
Which is it's almost creepy, and it's kind of it's playing on genre. I love it when these movies that are so old play on genres that we still have and that still translate, because I mean, I don't even know what the state of genre was in 1927. I mean, it's all coming from, you have your literary genres and theatrical genres, I guess. And then, but I mean, they're playing on this creepy thing of mistaking the guy for the wax figure. And it's all played kind of cutesy, but just, I guess just the nature of wax museums makes it kind of creepy.
I kept thinking about the Vincent Price movie, House of Wax.
Okay. I haven't seen that one yet, but I have seen the...
oh, it's good. It's really good.
The Twilight Zone episode, The New Exhibit, which is just all I could think of. But that's kind of an exception in this movie. The rest of the movie is very kind of extravagant. They're in this luscious house. I mean, after that, the movie's almost like a bottle movie.
Yeah, once they get to the mansion, they kind of
Yeah.
stay there.
Almost like a rules of the game kind of a thing, where they're just all kind of running around, and each
Yeah.
character is like having different interactions with each other in various parts of the house, and playing on each other. So Clara Bow's character starts like she's not only trying to kind of get the main guy to like her more and more, and pull him away from his fiance. Then she's also like using. I wasn't actually sure what the full plan was with seducing the old man. I think it was just to get him to let go of the arranged marriage thing.
Yeah, it was all to break down the arranged marriage.
Yeah. So she seduces the other girl's dad, and he's all for it. And then the other girl has her own fiance. So some of these things like are kind of tropey these days, but they all kind of like they're just weaving this kind of like intricate plot web that sets up for a big nice bow at the end, which actually is it's kind of edgier than you would expect for this kind of movie, but it's also what goes into making it pre-code, because I think there are definite like clear signs of the pre-codeness of this movie. Definitely Merrily We Go to Hell, but this movie has some of those too, even though it's probably the most straight-laced of the three that we're looking at today.
Yeah, that's fair. That's definitely fair. This one's very traditional in a lot of ways. And you can definitely tell that how early this is in Arzner's career as well, because this is very much basically and this is not to disrespect the movie or the people who made it, it's basically a run-of-the-mill studio film.
I don't think the people who made this movie are going to be offended, Alex.
I don't. One, they're dead. Two, yeah, I don't think they would be either. I think this is very much just something that came off the line. But you can't see. But it's nice to look at for those signifiers of things that make Dorothy Arzner films Dorothy Arzner. The people are more empathetic. The power dynamics are a little different. The characters are more interesting. Or at least a little more fleshed out than we typically see female characters being, especially this early on in film history, which is all very refreshing and interesting to look at. I also like that there's this angle in here of the clever American outwitting the foolish European nobility.
The very traditionalist, like staunch Europeans too. It was definitely like almost a loose American gets the tight Europeans to loosen up kind of a thing. Like it was pretty blatant along those lines.
Yeah, it very much was, which was fun. But it was also very, it felt very 1920s, 1930s, pre-World War II. Americans aren't like stronger. They're more clever. They're smarter. They stay out of things that they're not meant to be in. But when they get there, they outwit.
And they're less staunchy, which goes into the quote unquote scandal bit at the end. But before we get into that,
imagine a time when the world thought Americans were more liberal than the rest of it.
But yeah, so one thing I noticed directorially about this movie that I thought was interesting is the way that Arzner uses her framing. And she does a lot of times in this, and this goes into the whole aspect of it being kind of a bottle movie inside of this house. But especially in that night scene when the main dude is going to tell her that he loves her again and he's going to get out of his prearranged marriage, but then also the dad that she's been hitting on is going to woo her with his little flute thing or whatever. And
I believe it's a piccolo.
His piccolo. I'm sorry. And so they're all kind of like sneaking around the house doing this kind of Scooby-Doo thing. And she does a lot of times showing like you have a frame of, someone in a room, and then through a doorway, you can see even more information. And so she does this a lot of times where she creates like a frame within a frame with doorways, which I think is really nice because a lot of times in these really old silent films, the compositions can tend to look kind of flat, just based on kind of the way that they had to shoot it with the lighting. They have to shoot kind of
also very fast, very much kind of like a factory off the line.
Yeah, and it's almost more theatrical where they just have like drop down sets kind of thing. And but so using that depth and using doorways and things like that, I thought was really good and kind of showed her her just ability on a technical level. 'Cause, it goes back into our conversation about technical directors versus actors directors. And I think that Arzner does a really good job of balancing that line because, she's got to do a really good job with the actors because her character dynamics are always so complex in all three of these movies that we're going to see. But she doesn't neglect the really technical aspects of creating a good frame and conveying information through the way that you're framing things, even when, the quality of the film is, 1927 is not the most high fidelity, like best
AKA HDR.
Yeah, right. Which going into like the technical quality of film is a different discussion, but the way that it was presented and the way that it's been preserved, means that you don't get quite as much information, but if there's a way that you can do stuff like that and still get it across, it's really impressive.
I remember this being a more difficult movie to pull stills from just based on the quality of the preservation, but there were quite a few interesting shots in there, and those do really show her history as an editor and as an apprentice. You can't come away from looking at hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of footage and being told to pick the best shots without coming away with a good idea of what makes a good shot.
At least a lot of opinions about other people's shooting. Yeah,
right. The best of them know how to shoot well. The worst of them just criticize.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the finale of this movie, because I think that is something that's really interesting, and it technically probably could have happened after the code went into effect, but it's kind of towing the line because so we're going to get into spoilers here. You can find this movie on YouTube or whatever. Plus it's practically 100 years old at this point. So so at the very end, Clara Bow's idea is to create this she creates an impression that she has taken her relationship with the other guy to a marital extreme. I'm going to say this very diplomatically.
We all know what you're talking about, Jonathan.
And so she stomps around in the room, blah, blah, blah. She gets everyone to come there, and then she rushes into his arms, and he's all very confused. This is definitely the most, if you want to call it manipulation, probably definitely falls in that category. But she runs into his arms, so
I wouldn't call it nefarious, but it is manipulation.
Yeah, it's manipulation. So she's created this big impression, which then almost doesn't get her out of being pursued by the other girl's dad, which is also kind of scandalous, I feel like. But then it kind of solves all the problems. It creates a bad image kind of a thing, but then first of all, the main guy's dad kind of catches on to it at some point. The other girl's dad is just kind of clueless. But the main girl's dad is oh, well, we have to save our honor. So the honor thing kind of saves them, but also is kind of an excuse. So it's just really interesting that they bring it all together, but the way that they do that is with a really kind of a scandalous implication, even though the audience knows that.
Well, what could stuffy Europeans fear more than a scandal?
I know, right? And so she's playing with these ideas of kind of the traditionalism and the rigidity of the, at least on the face of things, the kind of moralistic facade. And she uses that and plays with it and kind of breaks it down without really breaking it down, because it's just an implication in the way that is portrayed here.
She's very hinted at.
But she's able to play with those boundaries really well. And it comes off really fun and sweet and all that stuff. But it is something that I feel like a couple of years later would be much harder to get through. Even though it probably could, sure. It almost falls into the Walls of Jericho kind of a situation like we talked about with It Happened One Night.
It definitely does.
But it's still is kind of towing that line. She's definitely, and she does that with all three of these movies.
Very much a not in a wink situation. Not in a wink situation.
Yeah, yeah. Even Dance Girl Dance was way more implicative than I was expecting, which because it came out after the code was in effect.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely ways to get around parts of the code. And one of the heaviest ways was to imply things.
Yeah, which people found no end of ways to imply things.
Which almost made a lot of them... Yeah, which made a lot of it almost more fun and interesting and funny. And I think this is one of those instances of where maybe they didn't have to, but maybe they'll add this in just to make it funnier. Like the implication in and of itself is actually pretty funny.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's that whole thing because, I mean, part of the whole gag is that he's so clueless as to what's going on. He's just kind of like getting pulled along for the ride, which is kind of his entire character.
Which is hilarious. Yeah, he has no idea what's going on.
Which is why I'm not sure I would even call the romance two-sided. I think it is kind of
That's
one-sided, but on her side rather than his side.
Yeah,
whereas
well, he's definitely interested. He just has no idea what's going on.
Yeah, and when you're talking about like one-sided, like borderline creepy relationships, I'm thinking of and not to like disparage the movie because we talked about it before, but like You've Got Mail, where once Tom Hanks' character kind of gets
there is a part of that movie that gets really creepy.
Yeah, he's definitely pulling the strings, and like that's why that story is so dependent on who plays the male character, because without a Tom Hanks or a Jimmy Stewart, it could go wrong really quickly. There's a really fine line to be towed there. Whereas here, it's a similar kind of thing, but it doesn't feel as creepy because it's on the other foot. The shoe's on the other foot here.
And Frederick March is a pretty good actor. In fact, he had quite a number of hits, actually. I believe he was in the first Oscar winner. I believe he was in Wings. Or maybe that was Rogers again.
Yeah. Buddy Rogers and Clara Bow were both in Wings.
It's freaking Buddy Rogers every time. Is that Frederick Marsh? Nope. Buddy Rogers.
Yeah, so both of our stars for this movie are in Wings, which I guess we'll have to get to Wings at some point. It's the very first Oscar winner.
Yeah, it's actually one of the better Oscar winners, too, which is sad. Oscar winner. I went through that whole list at one point, and it's a roller coaster of a history.
Oh, I'm sure. All right, cool. Anything else specifically about Get Your Man, Alex?
Not that I can think of.
All right.
It's basically setting up her career.
Yeah, it is. And we'll see how that progresses in a much darker take in Merrily We Go to Hell. Take it away, Jason.
Merrily We Go to Hell from 1932. Jerry Corbett, an aspiring playwright and alcoholic, meets and falls for heiress Joan Prentice. She falls in love as well, and soon the two are engaged against the advice of her father. Jerry manages to ruin the engagement party with his intoxication, and after the marriage, he drunkenly ventures out to meet his ex-girlfriend, to which Joan responds by taking up drinking and having affairs herself. As the two descend farther and farther into the grips of addiction and a failed marriage, Jerry begins to realize that he actually does need and love Joan, but quite possibly too late.
Jonathan, we have sound.
Yes, we have sound in the movie.
But I would like to start off not by talking about sound, but the visuals, which are still rock solid in this movie. And I think the introduction of our first character, drunk as a skunk at a table, is one of the best I've ever seen.
Into. Yeah.
Because we start with the party that's going on, then we move away from the party and we see how isolated and sad this guy is. And then we see he's literally put a wall up in front of himself, made out of alcohol. Like,
actually, you're backwards on that. We start with him outside on the balcony, and then we kind of zoom out. He's got a bunch of bottles in front of his face, which is like the very first image we see. And then he's like flicking caps and like mumbling about all the happy people inside. And then they pan over.
I gotcha.
But no, the visual itself of just like seeing him, buried in this wall of alcohol bottles is such a good way. Going back to our very first episode on this show where we talked about the way that Spielberg sets up his entire movie just based on his first scene. He'll tell you everything that the movie's about in the very first scene. And that's kind of what this is doing, but it's almost doing it in one shot. And almost, if you look at this frame, because I just pulled it up on YouTube again, you could almost see it more abstractly as like the alcohol bottles are almost like flames. Like I'm going to go really abstract here with like
the
flames of hell.
He's isolated himself in hell.
Yeah, and
alcoholism.
The alcohol is the hell that he has buried himself in, which is just the constant driving thing throughout the entire rest of the movie.
Yeah. No, this actually is like a really kind of like dark look at addiction.
It's so dark.
In a really
it's almost
tough way.
Greek. I really was trying to come up with a direct Greek comparison, but I feel like, I mean, it's a bacchanalia disaster.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And this is the kind of look at addiction that you don't get again until The Long Weekend, which I think is the early 50s. Because the code just slams down on top of everything. And this movie actually doesn't escape the code or Hollywood sensibilities entirely. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about the Hollywood ending tacked on to this movie.
Yeah.
But it's also made very clear by how short it is and how Dorothy Arzner cuts it, that where her real true ending of this movie is.
It ought to be a tragedy. It is intended to be a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. And it very much is.
Yeah.
Jonathan, we have sound.
We have sound, Alex.
We do have sound, but we have 1932 sound, which is a very different type of sound than what we're used to. Even in what you think of as like high classical Hollywood, late 30s, 40s into the early 50s, this is a very different sort of sound, and you can hear it. Like you can hear the sound drop out and then pick back up whenever an actor speaks, or just the rare use of score throughout most of early 1930s movies, where there's just a lot of like complete silence. So it's almost like, in a way, Hollywood takes a few years to transition fully from a silent film into a sound film in its entirety, at least in the way that we interpret sound films these days. But in this case, we're kind of a half step through that process. So you've got this interesting, awkward sound where it's used basically just for dialogue and occasionally some music, but there isn't much sound design beyond that. Like ambience is not a thing.
Yeah, right. Which works, especially for this film, like as kind of dramatic as it is. Like a lot of times that silence helps you sort of process it without, what can happen where the score is like forcing the emotion down your throat kind of thing. Which, we've for the most part gotten to a point where we've figured that out. We know how to do a nice compliment without just like boop, 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 we're happy, blah, 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 we're sad, kind of a thing. But I mean, it's kind of a different experience that if you're not used to it, you kind of gotta again just kind of get into the mode of the film. But then once you're into it, you're like, okay, and you kind of go along with the rest of the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just a style thing. It's like an interesting kind of like archaic note to notice about this movie, but it definitely doesn't take away from the story that's being told, which is so deeply tragic. And again, is kind of like a star-crossed lovers thing, very similar to Get Your Man, but it's more like the completely doomed lovers.
Yeah. And it's almost, I don't know, I feel like there's so much to unpack here that I haven't even completely worked through, but it almost goes into this thing that sometimes called like the Beauty and the Beast effect, where when you're getting into a relationship where one of the people is very flawed and the other person goes into the relationship expecting to be able to change them and fix them.
I want to fix him.
Yeah, but that pretty much never happens, which is why it can be a really toxic thing. And this shows, this is showing how that doesn't work. And, the person that you got involved with, the person that you married, is going to be the same person. If they're going to change, it has to be on them. It's not going to be necessarily on you, or you can't expect it to be anyway. And, a lot of times we think of like, Hollywood glitzy movies as showing the opposite. They show, oh, they were a perfect match, and so he eventually turned his life around. Whereas they kind of do in this movie, but again, it's kind of a throwaway thing. Really what it's showing is, no, he is just as messed up after they get married, no matter how good she is, how quote unquote swell she is.
Yes. Oh God, they say that so many times.
But
no, it's actually a very conscious point that's made in the movie. It's like a technique that's used. I thought it was just an archaic use at first. I was like, oh wow, they really did say swell a lot. And then she was like, why do you always call me swell? Why do you never say you love me?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh,
that becomes one of the biggest things.
Clever.
Yeah. So, I mean, it did get really annoying, but when the movie knows what it's doing with it, then, you can keep those things as long as you can justify them and not just make them kind of kitschy.
Yeah. God, there's some dark turns in this movie, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because
she gets dragged right down with him.
But she does have an element of agency, which I want to bring up because even though she does get dragged down with him, there's
she makes the choice.
Yes, the most interesting part of the movie is the scene with the door. The scene where he's about to go to his old girlfriend. They're already married. He's going to go out and, be with her. She knows it. He knows it. He says, if you love me, you will stop me from going out. And you'll close that door and lock it and throw away the key, and I will stay here tonight. And instead, she opens the door, and she's like, go. So it's almost like he is using it as... It's almost like he's saying that if I do this, it will be your fault because I warned you, kind of a thing, which is kind of a manipulative type of thing.
It's fairly low. He just wants the agency off of him.
Yeah. Although it is not to say that her restraining him would necessarily be a bad thing, but when he makes it a command like that,
that's
it changes the dynamic. And so she flips that on its head and she says, no, I'm going to let you go. So now it's on you if you walk out that door because, I'm opening it. And if you love me, you won't go. So there's this really, really strong power dynamic. And of course he does go. And then the movie flips on its head because she takes it and runs with it the other direction. And we get another star that I was not expecting to see in this movie. Very, very early in his career. You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, no one ever expects Cary Grant.
No one expects Cary Grant in this kind of movie where he becomes...
No one ever expects the Spanish Inquisition.
He basically becomes like her boy toy from this point out. And so then they have this really like flippant open marriage where... And this is where, they're... The Merrily We Go to Hell thing like really comes to fruition where they're just going out and drinking and, being out on the town and everything. And it's really painful to watch because you are set up, sympathizing with both of them. Like you really want him to turn his life around and you really like her because she's set up as kind of the kind of model, innocent kind of girl looking for true love kind of thing. And so both of those things have been basically destroyed at this point, and you're just kind of like waiting to see what will happen.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, he's a drowning man, and she refuses to let go of him. And she repeatedly makes the decision to stick around and just go deeper into the water until they're both really, really drowning. Oh, man. I mean, the scene where at the party where they're like playing out that movie scene is just so sad. There's so
much that goes into it. And there's a lot of like the way that it's set up is, again, it's so like Grecian because it's like there's the foreshadowing of the other lady. I wasn't even totally sure what her whole like history was or there was something about her like failed relationship, and she was like warning her at the very beginning, and then that all kind of fell apart. But okay, so the phrase "Merrily We Go to Hell," Alex, how did you think that kind of came off within the movie? Because it is a diegetic like thing.
Yeah, it is things they say. It's almost like
It's almost clunky though.
it's a little clunky, but I get what it's going for. It definitely came out of a writer's room, and then it was like, maybe we should work on this a bit. They just kind of went with the first thing.
So to preface, like every time that he starts drinking, he does a toast and he says, "Merrily we go to hell," and then he takes a swig or whatever. But it's not like a common thing that people say, and it felt like they were just like, it was definitely setting up a thematic thing for the movie, and it just felt like really ham-fisted, kind of. Like if they'd used it once, maybe it would have worked, but it never really felt natural anytime he said it.
Not at all. But I mean,
I
the
like
sentiment.
the title, but the
totally
line
get the
doesn't
sentiment.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Maybe if it said like once in the entire movie. But I mean, this is definitely like, essentially it's a catchphrase, and this is still very young Hollywood. They're trying to figure it out. I'm going to give them a pass.
It's almost like "Here's looking at you, kid," but it's just not as smooth as that.
Yeah. If it was said maybe once, like if they saved it for one time near the end of the movie, when he just really where he makes like a final decision, or like the crucial decision to drink one night, then it just screws everything up beyond repair. That would be a great time to drop it. But the fact that you so much kind of ruins it.
Which he does. So yeah, the relationship with alcohol thing is kind of interesting, because this goes again into the character dynamics and the power dynamics, but his relationship with alcohol almost directly mirrors his relationship with his old girlfriend. And were they ever married, or were they were just together and she broke his heart or whatever? I think she just broke his heart somehow.
I think so.
But like at the very beginning, he's, basically mourning her, and that's where he's, completely wasted at the party. And then after they get married, well, there's the really striking visual where they get married and he loses the ring, and so he puts a corkscrew on her finger, or like a bottle opener on her finger, and kind of like they kind of hide it so it just looks like a basic ring, which that in itself was a really kind of striking visual. But then he runs into his old girlfriend, and then the drinking starts up almost immediately. And so then like the farther they go down into that is when he starts just basically being with her more than his own wife and all that kind of stuff. And then kind of by the time he's given himself back over to her and back over to the drink, that's when she goes over to it too. So there's all these dynamics that are all kind of playing off each other, and it's all done so intentionally. It's not like any of this stuff was just kind of like thrown together. That's what I really like about all three of these movies, even though sometimes there's like some really heavy stuff in them, it's all like really intentional and thought-provoking.
Yeah, no, this isn't like just heavy for the sake of being heavy. This is thematic and important in an interesting way. Also resonant because this is, I think, just post-Prohibition, or maybe it's still during Prohibition.
I was actually just looking that up.
Ends with the 20s or with
I think it's technically 33, so it's like right at the tail end.
Yeah.
Because this movie comes
everyone
out
kind of already knew it was going.
32, yeah. Because I was wondering about that. I was wondering why they didn't bring it up at all, honestly. I kind of expected them to. But it did feel like...
It's a fantasy world. It's a slightly different dimension where Prohibition never happened, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, it's like... Because all the scenes where they're going to these really, like, lavish... I don't know, drinking parties or orgies or whatever you want to call them. I don't know exactly what was being implied with some of those scenes.
I don't think they're orgies. I think they're just like, for lack of a better term, bacchanal.
Yeah, basically.
Bacchanalia?
Yeah.
Bacchanali.
Whatever, however you conjugate bacchanai. So yeah, but they're like very lavish, and they almost felt like speakeasy scenes, but they were never really like intentionally mentioned that way. But the drinking, like so much drinking in this movie is something that is very, very pre-code because if drinking, I mean, obviously drinking had to be kind of condemned, which it is in this movie. I mean, especially to the excessive extent that is portrayed. But, and also like the open marriage thing, I'm fairly certain would not have flown 2 years later. You know, there's so much thematic stuff in this movie that would have had to have been like very dialed back a couple years later once the code goes into effect. And who knows? I mean, I haven't looked this up or anything, but this might have been one of the movies that really kind of kickstarted that that code push. But I'm sure there were way worse movies coming out.
I think the code was all but it formalized at this point. Essentially,
Just wasn't in effect.
Yeah. The code. So the code is important, but it's not like a line in the sand. It's more of like the culmination of Hollywood's self policing efforts over that had grown over the past decade. And we've talked about this before. Their effort to avoid being trust busted or have any regulation put over them by the government. So they're like, look at us, we're behaving, and slowly as pressures continue, they essentially just keep ramping up and keep ramping up and keep ramping up. And it culminated in the code.
I just looked at this. I just Wikipedia'd the code. I think we've talked about this before, but the Hays Code or the production code was something implemented finally in 1934, and then it ran all the way up to like late 60s. But it was a basically set of moral guidelines that all films had to more or less adhere to in order to be produced and released, largely influenced by like various Catholic institutions in California at the time and that kind of thing. But I just, on Wikipedia, the image is like a cover page for, I think it's for the actual code. It says, a code to govern the making of motion pictures, the reason supporting it, and the resolution for uniform interpretation. Which, if that doesn't sound like Orwellian rigidness, I don't know what does.
Oh, it 100% is. But alas, that's how things go.
Yeah.
But yes, it makes for some very interesting movies. You can already tell that this movie is dancing around certain lines. What did you think of the real ending and then the Hollywood ending, Jonathan?
Yeah, so let's describe that real quick. So there's, again, spoilers. I found a copy of this movie on YouTube, so you guys can go look it up if you would like. But we're going to talk about the very end of the movie now. So skip ahead if you wish. So at the very end of the movie, our main character, Sylvia Sidney's character, is not feeling well. She finds out that she's pregnant and
and drunk.
Pregnant and drunk, yeah, which is obviously a terrible combination.
I think that was a reality show on the History Channel at one point.
Are you serious?
No, but you believe me, which tells a lot about the situation.
Oh gosh, that's telling. So yeah, and she tries to tell her quote unquote husband at this point. I mean, technically they never got divorced, but she tries to tell her husband, but he's too busy philandering basically. And so then she runs away. She goes back to her father's house, who's basically been against him from the very beginning with very good reason. And then he finally follows after her after his girlfriend like makes him realize that he never loved her. Something really Hollywood romancy like that. He's like, oh, I never loved you. I only loved her. And so he runs back and finds out that she's in the hospital. And then we learn that the baby didn't make it. And she is, they're not sure whether she's going to make it or not. The dad's like, you can't go in there. You have no right to see the baby. He's like, it's my baby. And so he pushes past and goes in. And then he tells his wife that he loves her, which is the only thing that she's wanted to hear him say. And then they embrace and the movie ends.
Yeah. So it's a little forced. You can tell it's kind of meant to end with her death.
Yeah, almost like you could see it where, like, she dies right then, and then there was like a couple of things that they put in there at the very end that almost could have made for an extra reel or two on this movie, where where she's like, I want to see him. The dad goes out and says she doesn't want to see you. He pushes past him anyway, so that was kind of pointless. And then she says, I want to see my husband, and he's right there. And then he gets to tell her, I love you. But it almost could have been like she dies and then he says, I love you. Like, that feels like the more narratively cohesive ending.
It does. I get an odd sense from this movie, and I've gotten this from other movies from this same era, that their efforts weren't to focus on the ending, which is maybe misplaced, but there's almost this sense in a lot of movies from this time that they were like, well, the studios determine the ending. We don't really get much say over that, but we do get say over the middle bits.
It's about the journey, yeah.
Yeah, so there's almost this overemphasis on the second act, and oftentimes the first act as well. Mm-hmm. So hoping that the audience can just infer a good ending, which it sounds like you're basically doing right now.
Yeah, kind of. And the other thing that they don't bring up, which seems like a natural question, is he even the baby's father? Because it seems like there's a very small possibility of that.
Maybe not. That's up for the audience to decide. And they are very covert about that implication.
Yeah, they don't even imply anything about that. But the idea is, like, they haven't been together. I mean, I assume that their whole separation was, at like 6 months to at least a year, if not more. Like, we don't know how long that time was, but I have a feeling that there's a much better chance it's Cary Grant's baby.
If it's born with like a tan and a really strong chin, we'll know.
Yeah. So I mean, the ending definitely, it's striking, but the meat of the movie is, the journey. It is watching what could have been a fairy tale, a Beauty and the Beast kind of story turn into a complete disaster,
but it didn't.
And tragedy. Yeah. And how that breaks her spirit and eventually
kills him.
Well, yeah, but I was also going to say it almost redeems him, but it almost redeems him after it's too late.
Yeah, which is kind of the point.
Yeah.
Which is one of the more poignant parts of tragedy too, when somebody's left behind to look upon their work and weep.
Yeah.
But not in the Ozymandias sense.
No, it's realizing the mistake after there's no reconciliation.
There's no way to undo it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're stuck with it, and you're stuck alive. Which is his own kind of hell that he's now found himself in, that he went to. Not so merrily, but he went there.
Yeah. And he drug an innocent along with him.
He did at that. Well, shall we move on to Dance Girl Dance from 1940?
Yes, let's do it.
Jason, take it away.
Dance Girl Dance from 1940. Judy is an aspiring ballerina who is currently working as a chorus girl alongside Bubbles, a cynical blonde willing to do anything to get ahead. One night they meet Jimmy, a tormented rich young man in the midst of a divorce. Judy's teacher takes her for an audition with a ballet impresario, but en route, a tragic bus accident keeps her from making the introduction. Bubbles, meanwhile, has become a successful burlesque star and offers the desperate-for-work Judy a job as her stage stooge, which she reluctantly takes, suffering the jeers and heckles of her ballet act as a build-up for Bubbles' striptease performance each night. From the bus to the coincidence of who attends the burlesque show each night, life throws everything it has at Judy as she tries to overcome and chase her dream her way.
This movie has gone definitely more mainstream than the other two. It's the only one that I could find an easy version to rent online. And it has been put in the National Film Registry and stuff like that. So people know about this movie more. I mean, it's still kind of fringe cinephile fare, but
there's a number of more touchstones in here. Lucille Ball's in it, obviously. Rosalind Russell is the star. And oh gosh, what's his name?
Maureen O'Hara.
Maureen O'Hara. That's it. Not Rosalind Russell. My bad. Different redhead. Maureen O'Hara is the star. And then, as I did not know, Jonathan, but you pointed out to me, Robert Wise edited this just before he did Citizen Kane.
Yeah, and we've talked about Robert Wise because he shows up just like in the most random places in classic Hollywood, and eventually
he's
directs
kind of one of those guys
such a range
all over the place.
Yeah, so from like editing some of the most classic films to directing some of the most classic
Doesn't
films.
he do like West Side Story and Star Trek?
West Side Story, Star Trek, Singing in the Rain. No, not Singing in the Rain. Sound of Music, and what's the other one that's out there? Oh, The Day the Earth Stood Still. So like everywhere, he is everywhere, and we'll do an episode on him one day. But so we talked about Dorothy Arzner starting out as an editor, and the last film we're talking about today is one where her editor goes on to become a famous director in his own right.
Yeah, very much so. Which is interesting. So, Jonathan, this is kind of a movie that almost completely forgoes the classic Hollywood romance plot. Even if it's not, and typically in classical Hollywood, even if we see romance as not as the A plot, we at least see a very strong romance as the B plot. And while that's kind of there
somewhere
here,
in there,
it's not nearly as strong. And it's very pointedly at one point kind of pushed to the side by our lead.
The quote-unquote romances that happen in this are really just vehicles. The romance is almost a MacGuffin the entire time. Because it's mostly about the contrast between Maureen O'Hara's character and Lucille Ball's character. It's the abuse of innocence and the
they're both being very,
pitfalls
very,
of
very
greed,
exploited.
I would say.
Yeah.
But
Lucille
in
Ball's
different
character Bubbles just kind of leans into it a bit more and starts to get ahead because she's willing to
do anything for money, basically.
Literally just completely cater to the male gaze. That's expressly what she's doing.
Because she wants mostly what she wants is money. We see that when she marries the rich guy, and then is totally fine with divorcing him for more money. But also it is an element of her own vanity, and she gets some sense of like distorted satisfaction out of being desired by everybody.
Yeah,
and to the point where she projects a desire by Maureen O'Hara's character, and just assumes that everything Maureen O'Hara does is because she's jealous of herself, which is not the case. But she's so conceited that she can't see past it.
It's actually there's a big part of this movie that's entirely about how the male gaze divides women into two groups: prudes and whores, and they'll complain about both.
Yeah, it's
the very strict
Madonna whore complex.
Yeah,
that's what it's called, right?
Maybe I'm not that up to date on my sociology, but possibly. If you know something about it, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Okay. In psychoanalytic literature, Madonna whore complex is the inability. It's a Freudian thing, basically, where exactly what you were saying. They either see them as like saintly Madonnas or completely debased with very little gray area. And the movie does that. It creates a very stark contrast. So in this one, it's not kind of the loss of innocence in the way that Merrily We Go to Hell was for our main lead. It's more she kind of allows herself to be taken advantage of in more of like a fiscal way than like any kind of a physical way, and like a demoralizing kind of way. She allows that in order to kind of hold on to her own dignity, and eventually it wins out. But for a long time, it's like the more promiscuous character gets the upper hand for a large portion of the movie. But there's this really interesting thing, like one of the things that I was noticing is like every time we see Bubbles, she is like draped in a different fur or a different hat, or she has a different man or whatever. So she's constantly accepting favors from men in a really literal sense. Also, obviously that goes into layers of subtext. But then when we get the scene of Maureen O'Hara, who won't even accept the ballet dancer guy to hold an umbrella for her, it kind of, it goes into a little bit of her pride, but also her modesty. And it's just like, it's a really stark contrast between, not even accepting kind of like a really gracious act because she's seen the pitfalls of accepting too much from people who don't have your best interest in heart.
Yeah, she's essentially been traumatized in a sense. Like, she's seen how bad it can go. So, it's an interesting meditation on, like, what... And the theme is just so interesting because it's so ahead of its time. It's like, what is it like to be a woman trying to succeed in the world, or even just, like, have the career you want to have, when all, like, your entire career is based around the idea of you having to cater to men in one way, shape, or form or the other.
And it gets blatantly polemic at the end, where Maureen O'Hara stands up and, like, just monologues at the...
it's such a good monologue. I love that monologue.
It's really good. But, like, the movie is saying stuff, and it is saying stuff to your face.
I love how in your face it gets. And it's all stuff that, for the most part, I think modern audiences are like, yeah, we agree with this. But I can imagine just how edgy this is for when it came out.
Well, see, and the thing is that I don't think that this movie has lost any of its relevance, because I could see a modern adaptation of this exact same plot, but you put it in the context of, like, Instagram models, and all the guys at the burlesque are like the comment section. Oh
God, they are.
It could almost exactly be like transposed into an internet context, because she's commenting on like the fact that the men feel safe because they're not going to get criticized by the women on stage. They just have basically a free pass, and how, like, their stupid faces look in the audience and that kind of thing. And, it could almost be exactly the same as, scrolling through Instagram and just posting the lewdest, stupidest comments on girls' photos. Like, this has not lost any of its impact in today's context. It's just, not quite as prevalent in a sit-down stage kind of a context.
Yeah. No, you're 100% correct. It is still very, very, very relevant, which is kind of super sad.
It is.
But it's one of the reasons I think why I like this movie so much, is it's saying things in a really accessible way that kind of need to be said. And also in a way that you like the characters. Like, I don't even dislike Bubbles throughout over the course of this movie. Yeah, she can be a little annoying sometimes, but I also understand
she can be downright evil sometimes.
She can. But I also totally understand how she ended up that way, and why she does the things she does. And even just the base level of empathy these characters have for each other is just impressive, especially compared to a lot of early 30s and 40s movies. Because I don't know if you've noticed this before, Jonathan. Maybe it's in an interest for conflict and plot and scenes, but a lot of people in 30s and 40s movies, and the majority of them, are just assholes. And I don't know why. They're all so mean. And I'm like, why are you so mean? Yes, this makes for an interesting movie, but I really don't want to believe that everyone in America was that mean at that point in time. But there's
Well,
so
also,
many nice
noirs
kind
were
people in
really
this
big
movie.
at that point.
That's true. In a noir, I don't mind it so much, but
Yeah, you expect it.
It's most of the time in the dramas that I'm like, why is everyone so awful
Yeah.
all the time? But
And
in
that
this
is-
one, I love it. I
Yeah.
love the mix of characters who are incredibly empathetic, or characters who are trying to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, or trying to do the wrong thing for the right reasons.
Yeah.
I also love the we're one step away from destiny. Whack! Here comes a bus.
Oh my gosh. The the freaking bus. And then we never
Yep.
see her again.
No, she's
Oh
dead.
gosh.
Of course we don't see her again.
Oh my gosh. But she like we don't go to a funeral, nothing. She's just gone.
That's how death works.
Oh man. Okay. Yeah. That came out of nowhere. But yeah, I mean,
this
even this movie,
very very brutal. This is not a kind movie.
No.
We saw that also in Merrily We Go to Hell, and I think it's something that if you look at just the topics of Dorothy Arzner movies or just read summaries of them, like you wouldn't think of it first. But she is very, very blunt about the way life can
she's
actually
not
be.
pulling punches.
No, it can be brutal. It can be harsh. It can be over in an instance. You can struggle your entire life and barely get anywhere. You can get dragged down in a toxic relationship. All very real shit.
It's almost like an Obi-Wan Kenobi thing where it's like, oh well, she's not doing anything for the rest of the movie, so let's just knock her out.
Basically.
But yeah, I mean, so that is one thing. When we get to like the ballet thing, and the silver lining of the movie is because there are some like really dark things. Like Bubbles like really bothered me because she does get so greedy and so conceited that she's the most unlikable of the characters. I mean, besides the burlesque audience, obviously, but the silver lining is that like you're just waiting. And it's set up this way intentionally, but you're just waiting for Maureen O'Hara to realize that the ballet guy is, the person that she needs to be with.
Oh,
but she's
man,
so
they come so
humble
close so
that
many
she
times.
won't figure it out.
Yeah.
And then she watches their ballet rehearsal, and so that also kind of brings this to a place where I feel like this has almost Grecian influence because they're basically putting on like a Greek play, and the contrast and the dynamics are so stark that I feel like Arzner is just pulling so much of this like really classical tone that makes the narrative feel so solid. But yeah, and even at the end of the movie, she's like, the last line is, "If only I had realized that you were the one, everything would have been solved so easily." And I'm like, yep,
Yeah.
I guess
no.
that's called plot, huh?
But it is plot, but it's also so well motivated because her characters are so complex. The reason she doesn't realize that he was the right one is because of the way life had treated her in the entire movie.
Because she was so humble, which
way
is her defining characteristic.
Yeah, she's humble, but also everyone else had screwed her over. Everyone else had been awful to her. Every other person who had approached her had been terrible. So she had no reason to think anyone was going to be nice to her. And we saw that on screen. So we totally understand why she was, not only why she was being humble, because that's like her natural characteristic, but also the fact that she has a very good right to be very suspicious of everyone who approaches her.
Mm-hmm. Also, if that lady hadn't got hit by a bus, she would have just explained the whole thing.
Oh yeah, no, she would have like given the introduction and would have been over in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So I guess good thing she got hit by a bus. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a movie.
Yeah, I know.
That's the kind of stuff you can get away with in a first act. You can't randomly kill characters off of buses in the second act.
Yeah, right. Because then it becomes a just real convenient, if not a Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah, but in the first act, it's an inciting incident, so you can do that stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, but man, it definitely leaves you feeling very convicted. Like it is talking to you, not just like in general terms.
Yeah.
So but also, I guess we haven't even got into the whole like Casablanca plot yet.
Oh yeah.
With Ferdinand.
Yeah, no, it's a little odd, but it's there.
Yeah, so there's so many layers. So like the last thing that we haven't really got into is the idea that she's in love with the guy who's just so wrong for her, which I mean, it's very blatant about, he's just gotten divorced. He's a drunk. He still has feelings for his ex-wife. All this kind of stuff. He's like super rich, although he's not. His richness is not really one of his failings because he's not very haughty about it, at least from what we see.
He's not the worst rich person we've ever seen in a movie by a long shot.
Yeah, exactly. But the interesting dynamic is that like she sees a spark of goodness in him that she latches onto, and he longs for her, innocence for lack of a better word. Like he's drawn to that, even though it's almost like a Merrily We Go to Hell situation where he would have just like brought her down with him because he's so flawed, and he wasn't ready to change yet, or at least not in the way that, would have needed to happen for them to actually work. And so they're toying around with this relationship until Maureen O'Hara like kind of gets his full backstory and that kind of thing. And then, okay, so the court scene, which is 80% inspiration for the ending of What's Up, Doc. After the cat fight and everything. So in the court scene, Maureen O'Hara's character just like goes total psychoanalysis on every person there. Like she's figured all these people out. She figures out what makes them tick and why they've like where their flaws are and everything. And she just like
she puts everyone in their place.
Exactly. And then she still gets the butt end of the deal where she has to go to jail for 10 days. So I think that part is just like such a good wrap up because I mean, it's what you want from a movie, right? You want someone to just like get it. There's one person who gets it and is going to just like lay it all out for you.
Especially if it's an intricate like movie like this with a lot of character plot and you're like, you just want to scream at all the characters. What's up with them? It's like, this is why your life sucks. You keep doing this. Stop it.
Yeah.
And then to have a character stand up and tell everybody that, especially in the third act, and especially your protagonist who's realized what makes herself tick as well.
Yeah.
Is just so cathartic.
And again, it goes into the power dynamics again, because at this point, she has been the underdog for the whole thing, which we've seen before. But Bubbles is so obsessed with having the power, having the upper hand, like we saw in Get Your Man, where she's constantly manipulating people, but much more on a nefarious level than in Get Your Man. And so we've grown to dislike Bubbles because of the way that she manipulates both the men and the women characters for her own gain. And then Maureen O'Hara finally, who's just kind of like humbly submitted herself to this. She knows she's being taken advantage of. She's not naive. By the end of it, I mean, she's like getting realizations as she goes through. But she knows what's happening. And then in the court scene, she finally is the one who has the power. In none of the scenes do the men ever have are holding the power in the scene. So even the scenes with the Ferdinand guy, he's never like overbearing or anything, maybe in the scenes with his wife, but those are kind of inconsequential. So it's always either Maureen O'Hara's character or Lucille Ball's character that are really
holding the power.
Yeah, in any given scene.
You could make an argument that the director of the ballet has some power here, but
only in like the very last shot.
Because Maureen O'Hara's character rejects him repeatedly throughout the movie when all he wants is to put her in the ballet.
Be nice to her, yeah.
He doesn't really have any of the power. He doesn't have the power to give her the job she wants. She's really the one in her own way from getting that job. And once she comes to her own self-realization, she gives herself the power to take the job, which is a really nice touch. Mm-hmm. The more we talk about it, the more I think that this is decidedly Arzner's like masterpiece.
Yeah,
of her
which
particular skill set.
Which is why I think it's the one that has captured so much cultural imagination, because there's so many levels that all interweave pretty fluidly.
It's so good, and yet it's so rarely ever talked about.
Probably the the like most jarring part of it is probably the freaking bus, which is just a really the most convenient thing that happens.
It is. But there is a big theme in the movie too that life is cruel, and it just kind of throws stuff at you, so it kind of fits.
Yeah, because she's constantly getting stepped on.
Yeah, and it happens so early in the movie too that you can kind of accept it. Like that was very much a piece of destiny for her that took her away from the path she was essentially meant to be on, and takes her a while and some self-realization to get back to.
Mm-hmm. And so the last thing as we kind of wrap this movie
Jonathan?
Is the last thing I want to bring up is that we should not be portraying birds. We should be portraying the American condition. The freaking ballet guy who is like dictating to his stenographer, and he's like, write this rejection letter because her audition was just about, being a bird. I'm tired of watching people dance like birds. I want to see what makes America tick. What is the problem with America? And there's just like, he just like goes off on this whole like ballet cliche tangent. I was just like, it was a throwaway thing, but it was so funny.
Yeah, no, it was random, but very, very funny. I like that it's almost a musical at times, but mostly it's just kind of a dancicle.
But Lucille Ball actually does get a couple of singing bits.
That's true, she does.
Which, as my wife pointed out while we were watching it, isn't her whole thing in I Love Lucy that she can't sing?
Well,
and so she could never be in Ricky's band. And she can actually kind of sing.
Yeah.
Although, obviously, that was not the point of her performance in any of the parts of this movie, but it did not come off badly.
All right, Jonathan, let's move into overall note, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it. We've kind of hit a lot of stuff already just within the meat of this, but...
I think the biggest thing is just the complexity of her characters, and I think, especially in a time where it just didn't happen anywhere else, except maybe in George Cukor movies, female characters having agency, having power in situations equal to or even surpassing that of the male characters in the same movies, which is just rare, especially for this period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the complex and thematic levels that go into everything, and her transition from silent to sound. So many regardless, male female directors did not make that
director
transition.
Actors, a lot of people just could not hop over.
Even some of the biggest names that we still look up to, like Buster Keaton, just couldn't make it happen for whatever reason. There's obviously like politics and stuff that goes in there, and pandemics and blah 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 blah. But to overcome all of those excuses, of which there are many, and still make really great films throughout that time, up until such a point as she stopped making movies for her own reasons, that is an impressive thing. And the fact that they still work, and they weren't like, sound wasn't detracting from it. It didn't feel like gimmicky, like, we're going to make a big film just with sound because we have sound. But, they're still really compelling stories. They have a lot to say. And that continued and almost just got deeper and deeper as her career progressed, at least through these movies that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, no, I totally get why she would be such a big influence on someone like Coppola.
I have a feeling, like I said, there's no way Bogdanovich wasn't familiar with her work. And I feel like there's
Bogdanovich would know her work. Bogdanovich knew every piece of work.
Yeah. I mean, I was going through, like, just watching Dance Girl Dance. I just, like, movie after movie kept coming to mind. Like Casablanca with, like, the depressed drunk guy who constantly going to clubs and is sad about his old relationship. Even, like, Singing in the Rain, where the chorus girl who, is being pursued to become a star, and she's kind of running away from it. Like, there are so many themes in these movies that feel like they continue through Hollywood and just resonate and get built on and built on and built on with more and more classic films that come out after this one. That, you know, I think Arzner's career has more of an impact than people realize who have maybe never even heard her name before.
Yeah, for sure. And she, I mean, it's definitely a pioneer in terms of just keeping the torch of female filmmaking alive throughout the 30s and 40s. And even though I don't think the two had a lot of interactions, essentially passing it on to Ida Lupino, who conveniently might be next week's topic.
Spoilers.
Hint, hint, wink, wink, although we're literally about to talk about that. But yes, and I think it's an important part of film history to study, because obviously the master filmmakers of the 30s and 40s are incredibly good and deeply worth studying. Your Hitchcocks and your Orson Welles,
Lubitsch,
Preminger, all of the amazing directors from that time period are definitely worth studying and should be studied. And they all have the highest profile movies, but they all have kind of similar viewpoints when it comes to gender. So being able to have a viewpoint outside of just that one singular male voice is nice and refreshing and deserves to be studied in how it existed in the past, and as we're seeing now, is definitely sought after and promoted, both within the artist community and within the fan community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I mean, it's kind of an example that talent has always been there. You know, it's never been necessarily the strongest voice or even proportionally correct. But again, like, you know, people are realizing that, and we're working on it. It's a progress. But you know, that talent is there. And so these nuggets of different viewpoints that exist from this time period are, like you're saying, they're definitely worth seeking out and studying, especially if you're studying all that other stuff, like to not limit it to, you know, just the greats as such, that are all kind of in one bubble. Like, as much as they can portray various experiences, they cannot all be coming from different experiences, you know, to some extent or another. I mean, you have obviously various levels of immigrant directors like Frank Capra and Fritz Lang and stuff like that. But, you know,
there's one boundary they can't jump over.
Yeah, where you find the Dorothy Arzner's and Ida Lupinos, it's worth making sure that gets into your study mix, and just making that study as broad as possible.
All right, Jonathan. So if you don't know, what are we going to be talking about next week?
Yeah, so as we've already spoiled, next time we're going to be talking about Ida Lupino, whose career starts pretty much right at the tail end of Arzner's and then goes into the late 60s, early 70s. And she starts off as an actor and then transitions into directing. So the very first film that we're going to talk about, she is acting in, is High Sierra from 1941. And then the final two films are her directing works, and that is The Hitch-Hiker from 1953, which is a thriller, and I believe it's public domain. You can find copies of it everywhere online, so definitely search that one out. And then The Trouble with Angels from 1966, which is more of an kind of almost like irreverent comedy kind of a thing. So very different tones. High Sierra is a thriller, maybe noir. I think it's a noir. So High Sierra and Hitchhiker are kind of similar, but they're coming from the same point of view, or the same type of genre. And yeah, so I'm very excited to see, you know, how that translates, especially across such a span of history, of film history, as the early 1940s to the mid to late 1960s, because the types of films that were being made across that span like changed drastically.
Yeah, there's a big shift in the 40s. Definitely kind of one of the more unnoticed shifts, especially compared to like the 60s, which is a big one. But definitely also one worth looking at. And basically the rise of indie cinema, which Ida Lupi now has a big part in. So that should be a lot of...
Hitch-Hiker is very indie.
Yeah, it should be interesting to talk about and take a look at in more detail. But I think... Oh, wait. Jonathan.
What is that, Alex?
What's going on the Patreon?
Yeah, we have a Patreon. If you would like to support us, you can do that. Jump over there for $3 a month. No, what? That's not even right. For $2 a month. Wow, it just got cheaper. For $2 a month, you can join our online community, which is a Discord server among other little behind-the-scenes tidbits and Netflix parties and stuff like that. And then for $5 a month, you can get extra content from us. So that's a bonus podcast, of which the last topic was... we talked about Quibi and specifically the show Most Dangerous Game starring Liam Hemsworth and Christoph Waltz. And so that was a very interesting talk about the first attempt at creating content specifically for your phone, no matter which way you want to hold said phone. And
perhaps it gets lost in the center, Jonathan.
Yeah, it got a little ranty, so that was fun. But yeah, that's our donations. Support us. We will love you for it. We love you anyway.
But that is all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And I'm at the Blue Jay, 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Jonathan, we have sound.
Oh, yes, in the movie. I was like, what, did something go wrong in our recording?
No. We have sound.
Yes, we have sound in the movie.